This aircraft should not have stayed in the air. That is not a dramatic claim. It is a mechanical one. Remove the cockpit of a bomber, and you remove the interface between human intent and aerodynamic reality. Without instruments, without a control column, without stable mounting points for flight controls, an aircraft does not struggle. It stops being controllable. And yet, on July 14th, 1944, an American heavy bomber did exactly what it was never meant to do. It kept flying. This moment did not change the outcome of a battle. It did not destroy a factory or sink a fleet. It did not appear in headlines or wartime propaganda. Most official histories mention it briefly, if at all. But hidden inside those minutes is something far more important, because this incident reveals a flaw in how air power was understood by planners, engineers, and commanders, and it helps explain why the air war evolved the way it did in the final year of World War II. The bomber was a B-17G Flying Fortress, part of the 15th Air Force, operating from southern Italy. By mid-1944, these crews were flying some of the longest and most dangerous missions of the war. Targets lay deep inside Axis-controlled territory, far beyond friendly fighter cover for much of the route. Every mission was a calculated risk. Crews understood that the bomber war was not won by brilliance on a single day, but by endurance over many days. Statistics mattered more than heroism. Aircraft were expected to take damage. Crews were expected to absorb losses. The system assumed that enough bombers would reach the target to justify those losses. What the system did not account for was what happened when damage crossed a certain threshold. Over Budapest, that threshold was crossed in a fraction of a second. An anti-aircraft shell detonated at the very front of the aircraft. The explosion did not tear open the nose, it erased it. The bombardier's station, the navigator's compartment, the instruments, the structure that anchored the flight controls, all of it vanished into the slipstream. 2 crew members were killed instantly. The bomber's center of gravity shifted violently. With the weight gone from the front, the aircraft pitched upward toward a stall. In normal circumstances, recovery would have been immediate. Forward pressure, power adjustment, correction. But there was nothing to push. The cockpit controls had been mounted to a structure that no longer existed. The pilot was suddenly seated behind an opening where the airplane ended. There were no instruments to reference, no gauges to confirm airspeed or altitude, no artificial horizon to stabilize orientation. The sky was no longer framed by glass, it rushed directly into the aircraft. At 30,000 feet, that air was lethal. Temperatures were far below freezing. Wind hammered the flight deck with enormous force. Sound collapsed into constant pressure. Blood from the blast coated the floor. And yet, the bomber did not immediately fall. This is where the story usually turns into legend. But what kept the aircraft in the air was not mystery. It was mechanics. Despite the destruction, the wings still produced lift. The engines still generated thrust. Most importantly, the steel control cables running through the fuselage had not been severed. Those cables were never meant to be touched by human hands in flight. They were designed to transmit precise movements from cockpit controls to control surfaces through pulleys and fairleads, shielded from airflow and vibration. Now they were exposed. Uncontrolled, those cables would oscillate violently in the slipstream, sending erratic signals to the rudder and elevators. The aircraft would become unstable within seconds. But if the cables could be restrained, if they could be pulled and released deliberately, then control was still theoretically possible. Not from the cockpit, from inside the aircraft. This is the paradox. The bomber survived not because it was structurally intact, but because it had failed in a way that left just enough of the system functioning to be exploited. The aircraft was no longer flyable in the conventional sense, but it was not yet unflyable. That narrow gap is where the crew found themselves. The men who could reach the cables were not pilots. They had no instruments, no view of the horizon, and almost no way to communicate with the man trying to keep the aircraft level at the front. About to turn a machine built on precision engineering into something crude and unstable, guided by strength, timing, and intuition. This moment exposes a truth rarely discussed in air war histories. Aircraft doctrine assumed that control resided at the front of the machine. When that control was lost, survival was considered impossible. What happened over Budapest showed that control could migrate improvised, redistributed, and sustained just long enough to matter. Those 10 minutes were not an anomaly. They were a warning. A warning that the limits of machines were narrower than commanders believed, and that survival often depended on decisions made far away from where those machines were supposed to be flown. To understand why those 10 minutes mattered, you have to understand how the bomber war actually worked. Not the version taught in simplified histories, not the version reduced to maps and arrows, but the version crews lived inside day after day, mission after mission. By 1944, American strategic bombing doctrine rested on a single assumption that formations, not individual aircraft, won wars. Bombers were designed to operate as parts of a system. Protection came from overlapping gunfire. Accuracy came from formation discipline. Survival came from numbers. The individual airplane did not matter. If one bomber was damaged, the formation continued. If a crew fell behind, the formation did not slow. If an aircraft could not maintain speed and altitude, it was left behind. This was not cruelty. It was arithmetic. The bombers of the 15th Air Force flew from bases in southern Italy toward targets in Central Europe, oil refineries, rail yards, industrial nodes that fed entire fronts. These were not short missions. They pushed aircraft to the limits of fuel endurance and crews to the limits of physical tolerance. Altitude was life. Flying high placed bombers above much of the flak and beyond the effective range of many fighters. But altitude came at a cost. Extreme cold, low oxygen, and a razor-thin margin between controlled flight and disaster. At 30,000 feet, a small error does not stay small. Aircraft behavior changes. Engines are less forgiving. Control responses become sluggish. Recovery from stalls becomes uncertain. Everything depends on predictability, on systems responding the same way every time. This is why the cockpit mattered. The cockpit was not just a place where pilots sat. It was the nerve center of the aircraft. Instruments translated the invisible airspeed, altitude, attitude into usable information. Control columns and pedals transformed intention into movement through a precise mechanical chain. Remove that chain, and the doctrine collapses. Bomber doctrine assumed damage would be distributed: holes in wings, engines knocked out, crew injured, but not the removal of control itself. The manuals described fires, depressurization, structural damage. They did not describe what to do when the airplane lost the ability to be flown in the way it was designed to be flown. Over Budapest, that assumption failed. The shell that erased the nose did more than kill 2 crew members. It invalidated the logic the entire system depended on. The aircraft could still generate lift and thrust, but it could no longer be commanded in the traditional sense. And yet, the crew did not immediately bail out. This is where most casual retellings oversimplify the story. Bailing out was not a simple choice. At altitude, over heavily defended territory, abandoning an aircraft was not an escape, it was an exchange of risks. Parachuting over enemy territory almost guaranteed capture. Injuries were common. Death was not rare. Crews stayed aboard damaged aircraft because staying aboard often gave them a better chance. But this aircraft presented a unique dilemma. It was still flying, but only barely. It was still controllable, but only indirectly. And every second it remained airborne, increased exposure to fighters, flak, and structural failure. The formation was moving on. Bombers that could not keep up were not protected. Lone aircraft were hunted. German fighters specialized in picking off stragglers. Flak batteries recalibrated for single targets. The doctrine assumed that if an aircraft fell out of formation, it would soon be destroyed. What happened next violated that expectation. Instead of abandoning the aircraft immediately, the crew attempted something doctrine never envisioned: redistributing control inside the fuselage. Not by replacing equipment, but by replacing systems with people. Men moved forward through the aircraft, navigating debris, wind, and freezing temperatures. They found the control cables exposed and unstable. These cables were never meant to be handled directly. They were under tension, vibrating violently in the slipstream. Holding them was dangerous. Too much force could overcorrect the aircraft. Too little force would allow it to drift into instability. Let go entirely, and control would be lost within seconds. There was no feedback loop. The men pulling the cables could not see the horizon. pilot could not see what they were doing. Communication was limited, unreliable, and often impossible over the noise. This was not flying. It was improvisation under pressure. What makes this moment important is not that it worked, but that it revealed something uncomfortable. Bomber survivability did not always depend on armor, firepower, or redundancy. Sometimes it depended on human adaptability, filling gaps designers never expected to exist. This realization would quietly influence how air forces thought about survivability in the final year of the war. Not in official statements, not in public doctrine, but in how crews were trained to think when systems failed. The aircraft over Budapest was no longer a fortress. It was a test, and the test was only beginning. Because the aircraft was still over enemy territory, still losing speed, and still facing a decision that would determine who lived and who did not. After the explosion was not chaos. It was something more dangerous. It was a brief, unstable balance, an aircraft still moving forward, still generating lift, but no longer responding to control in the way anyone understood. When the nose vanished, the bomber did not simply lose structure, it lost reference. Everything pilots relied on to understand flight speed, altitude, attitude, was suddenly abstract. There were no instruments to confirm what the aircraft was doing. There was only the horizon, partially visible through a violent opening where the airplane ended. The first threat was a stall. With the center of gravity shifted backward, the aircraft pitched upward aggressively. Airspeed dropped. Lift decayed. In a B-17 at altitude, a full stall was often unrecoverable. The wings could drop asymmetrically. The aircraft could snap into a spin. Recovery required altitude the crew did not have. Normally, this was where muscle memory took over. But muscle memory requires something to push. There was no control column. The pilot's hands found nothing where the yoke should have been. His feet pressed the rudder pedals, but the pedals were now disconnected from any stable mechanical resistance. Whatever control remained was no longer happening in the cockpit. For several seconds, the bomber existed in a narrow margin between flight and loss of control. What prevented immediate disaster was not action, but inertia. The engines continued producing thrust. The wings continued producing lift. The aircraft was, for the moment, flying itself. This illusion would not last. As airflow tore through the open nose, it began to affect the exposed systems inside the fuselage. The control cables, now naked to the slipstream, started to oscillate. Vibrations traveled along their length, feeding erratic inputs into the control surfaces. This was worse than having no control. Uncontrolled movement meant unpredictable movement. Left alone, the aircraft would soon begin to wander. Small oscillations would grow. A gentle yaw would become a roll. A roll would become a dive or a climb. At altitude, either could be fatal. Someone had to intervene. The first men to reach the cable runs did not fully understand what they were looking at. These were not levers or switches designed for human interaction. They were steel wire ropes under tension, vibrating violently, humming with energy from the airflow. Touching them was immediately painful. The steel was freezing cold. Gloves offered little protection. The force required to move the cables was far greater than expected. These systems were designed to multiply small pilot inputs through mechanical advantage, not to be hauled directly against aerodynamic loads. But when one man grabbed a cable and pulled, something unexpected happened. The aircraft responded, not smoothly, not precisely, but enough. A pull on the rudder cable caused the nose to yaw. A pull on the elevator cable changed pitch. The response was delayed, exaggerated, and difficult to predict, but it existed. This was the second paradox. The aircraft was no longer flyable in theory. But it was still flyable in practice if the crew could learn its new language fast enough. Coordination became the central challenge. The pilot could see the horizon, feel the aircraft's motion, and adjust engine power. But he could not directly command the control surfaces. The men on the cables could influence those surfaces, but they could not see what corrections were needed. This forced the crew into a dangerous feedback loop. Pilot input had to be translated into shouted commands, gestures, or instinct. Cable inputs had to be guessed, adjusted, and corrected without confirmation. Overcorrection could be just as deadly as no correction at all. All of this was happening while the bomber remained inside a hostile environment. Anti-aircraft fire was still bursting around them. The formation continued moving forward, maintaining speed and altitude. No one slowed to wait. From a distance, the bomber still looked intact enough to be a valid target. Then the situation worsened. A second shell struck the aircraft, this time hitting one of the engines. The explosion destroyed the power plant instantly. Flames and debris streamed backward along the wing. The propeller windmilled briefly, then seized. Now the bomber was flying on 3 engines. Survivable under normal conditions. B-17 seconds were famous for returning home on fewer engines. But normal conditions no longer existed. The loss of thrust increased drag imbalance. Yaw forces intensified. Airspeed dropped further. The aircraft began to lag behind the formation. This was the moment bomber doctrine predicted. A damaged aircraft, unable to maintain formation speed, fell behind. Once separated, survival rates plummeted. German fighters targeted lone bombers aggressively. Flak batteries could concentrate fire. There was no overlapping defensive fire, no mutual support. Yet something strange happened. The bomber did not immediately spiral out of control. Instead, the crew adapted. Hands adjusted their grip. Pulls became shorter, more deliberate. Timing improved. The pilot learned to use engine power as a crude form of control, adding thrust to induce yaw, reducing power to stabilize pitch. This was no longer aviation as taught. It was aviation reduced to fundamentals. Lift, thrust, weight, balance. The aircraft was shedding altitude slowly but steadily. Each 1,000 feet lost bought time but increased risk. Structural damage compounded with every vibration. The tail section flexed in ways it was never meant to. The crew understood what this meant. They were no longer fighting to complete a mission. They were fighting to delay the inevitable long enough to choose how it ended. And that choice, whether to stay aboard or abandon the aircraft, was about to split the crew into those who would live and those who might not. Point: the aircraft was no longer being flown. It was being managed. This distinction matters, because flying implies control through designed systems. What was happening inside the bomber was something else entirely, a fragile negotiation between human strength and aerodynamic force. The control cables had become the aircraft's only remaining interface. They were crude, exposed, and hostile. Every vibration in the fuselage traveled directly into the men holding them. Every gust of wind tried to rip the cables from their hands. There was no redundancy here. If one cable slipped, the aircraft would respond instantly. If one man lost his grip, the balance would shift. If 2 men pulled at the wrong time, the correction would overshoot. This was not teamwork in the cinematic sense. It was synchronized risk. The men on the cables learned quickly that force alone was useless. Pulling harder did not equal better control. The aircraft responded best to short, timed inputs, brief corrections followed by restraint. The goal was not to command the aircraft, but to prevent it from commanding itself. This forced an entirely new mental model of flight. Normally, a pilot reacts to instruments. Instruments confirm reality. Reality guides action. That loop was gone. Now, action came first, and reality followed, sometimes violently. The pilot adjusted engine power in small increments, using thrust asymmetry as a crude steering mechanism. Increasing power on one engine induced yaw. Reducing power stabilized pitch. These changes were subtle, delayed, and unpredictable. The men on the cables had to anticipate these changes without seeing them. They learned through failure. When the aircraft dipped unexpectedly, they pulled too late. When it rolled, they pulled too much. Each mistake fed directly into the structure, amplifying stress on already weakened components. The tail section, in particular, was suffering. The B-17's tail was not designed to absorb constant oscillation. It relied on smooth airflow and predictable loads. What it was experiencing now was irregular, compounded stress forces pulling in multiple directions, out of phase with one another. This was the hidden cost of the solution. Holding the cables kept the aircraft controllable, but it also accelerated structural fatigue. Every correction transmitted strain through a fuselage already compromised by blast damage. The crew could feel this. Metal creaked. Framework flexed. Vibrations traveled through the aircraft in unfamiliar patterns. These were not sounds crews were trained to interpret, but they understood the message anyway. Time was running out. Here is the insight most people miss. From the outside, this looks like improvisation overcoming failure. But from an engineering perspective, it was the opposite. The crew was exploiting a narrow, temporary overlap between two unstable states. An aircraft damaged enough to bypass its designed control pathways, but not yet damaged enough to collapse. This overlap does not last long. The bomber was losing altitude steadily, not plunging, descending. Each minute bought distance from the target area but increased the likelihood of structural failure. Fuel status was unknown. The gauges were gone. The navigator was gone. There was no way to calculate remaining range or endurance. The engines ran smoothly until they didn't. This uncertainty forced a decision that Bomber Doctrine avoided addressing directly. When do you abandon a machine that is still working but only barely? Bailing out early increased survival odds on the ground but guaranteed capture. Staying aboard risked total loss if the aircraft failed catastrophically. Doctrine offered no guidance because Doctrine assumed control would fail before choice became possible. Here, choice existed, and that made it worse. The crew began to prepare for the possibility that the aircraft would not make it much farther. They repositioned themselves closer to exit points while maintaining control. Every movement altered weight distribution. Every shift changed how the aircraft responded. Leaving the cables unattended, even briefly, caused immediate instability. The aircraft wallowed. The wings dipped. Corrections became harder. This revealed a brutal truth. The aircraft could only remain airborne if enough men stayed aboard to physically control it. More men stayed aboard, the fewer would survive if it failed. Survival for the group required sacrifice by individuals. Survival for individuals required abandoning the group. This is where the story stops being about a machine. The men holding the cables were not pilots. They had no authority to command the aircraft. But in that moment, they held the most power. Their decisions would determine whether the bomber stayed airborne long enough for others to escape. The pilot understood this. He could feel the aircraft growing less stable as fatigue accumulated. He could see the horizon creeping upward as altitude bled away. He could sense that the solution keeping them alive was also killing the machine. And yet, he stayed. Not because Doctrine demanded it, not because training required it, but because time mattered. Every extra minute in the air meant more separation for those who would eventually jump, more distance between parachutes and wreckage, more uncertainty for search parties below. This was not heroism. It was calculation under pressure. The bomber was no longer a weapon. It was a timer. And the crew was deciding how long to let it run before it reached zero. The next decision, who would leave and who would remain, would fracture the crew and turn coordination into something even more dangerous. Because once people began to jump, the aircraft would become harder to control, and the margin they were operating within was already vanishing. But the first man let go of the cables, the aircraft changed. Not dramatically, not instantly, but enough. Control did not vanish, it degraded. And degradation, in flight, is often more dangerous than failure. Failure is decisive. Degradation is deceptive. It convinces you that you still have time. The bomber was already operating on borrowed stability. Every correction depended on hands holding steel, reacting to movement they could not fully see or predict. As long as enough people remained in position, that fragile balance held. But balance is not democratic. It does not tolerate absence. The decision to abandon the aircraft did not come as a spoken order. There was no announcement, no clear command. Communication systems were unreliable. Noise swallowed voices. Hand signals replaced words. Everyone understood the reality without explanation. The tail section was flexing more violently now. The metal framework that held the horizontal and vertical stabilizers was experiencing loads it had never been designed to absorb. Each correction, each pull on the cables introduced new stress cycles into already weakened joints. The aircraft was dying. Staying aboard no longer increased the chances of saving the machine. It only delayed the moment of collapse. And when collapse came, it would come suddenly. Bailing out became not an act of fear, but of logic. The first men moved toward the exits with deliberate speed. They clipped parachute harnesses with numb fingers. They positioned themselves at openings designed for controlled evacuations, not for abandonment under partial control. When the first man jumped, the bomber lurched. The cables slackened slightly. The aircraft yawed. A correction followed, but slower than before. One less set of hands meant reduced precision. Reduced precision meant larger movements. Larger movements meant greater stress. The men remaining on the cables felt this immediately. Their workload increased. The force required to hold the cables steady rose sharply. Small adjustments now required more strength, more coordination, more anticipation. Each jump made the aircraft harder to manage. This created a cruel feedback loop. The more people who left, the more dangerous it became for those who stayed. The more dangerous it became, the more urgent leaving felt. The aircraft responded by oscillating more aggressively. The wings dipped left, then right. The nose pitched unpredictably. The pilot compensated with engine power, but power alone could not replace control. Altitude continued to bleed away. The bomber was no longer falling, but it was descending with intent. A steady loss, measured in hundreds of feet per minute. Enough to be noticeable, enough to matter. At this point, the aircraft was alone. The formation had long since disappeared ahead. No friendly aircraft remained nearby, no mutual defense, no witnesses. This isolation mattered psychologically as much as tactically. Inside the bomber, the crew was no longer part of a system. There would be no rescue, no intervention. Whatever happened next would happen entirely within the boundaries of that damaged fuselage. More men jumped. Each departure changed the balance again. The pilot felt the aircraft growing sluggish. Corrections lagged. The bomber responded late, then too much. Stability became something that existed only briefly, between oscillations. Eventually, only a few remained. This was the moment most people misunderstand. It would have been safer for the pilot to leave earlier. It would have been rational for him to jump once the first men did. But safety was not his only variable. As long as the aircraft remained airborne, it continued to separate the men already under parachutes from the eventual crash site. Distance mattered. A few miles could mean the difference between immediate capture and hours of evasion. It could mean landing in farmland instead of near wreckage. It could mean confusion on the ground. The pilot understood this. Staying aboard was no longer about the aircraft. It was about time. Each extra minute aloft stretched the distance between falling men and falling metal. Each second increased uncertainty for those searching below. This was a calculation no doctrine addressed. The aircraft's design had never assumed a pilot would intentionally remain with a failing machine to increase the survival odds of others who had already left it. The manuals described evacuation procedures, but not this. And yet, the decision made sense. With only a few men remaining, control became nearly symbolic. The cables hung loose for long moments between corrections. The aircraft relied increasingly on inherent aerodynamic stability, something it no longer truly possessed. The pilot's hands stayed on the throttles. Engine power became the only consistent input he had left. He adjusted thrust instinctively, feeling for balance rather than commanding it. The bomber descended through thinner layers of air. Speed increased slightly. Control remained marginal. Eventually, only 2 remained aboard. At that point, the aircraft was no longer being actively controlled. It was gliding on momentum, stability, and chance. The co-pilot had no function left, no controls, no systems to manage. His presence added weight but no capability. The logic was unavoidable. He needed to go. When he left, the aircraft would be alone with the pilot. And when the pilot left, the bomber would become a falling object. The moment before that final separation was not dramatic. There were no words, no gestures, only understanding. The aircraft had given everything it could give. The men had taken everything they could take from it. What remained was a choice measured in seconds. Stay a little longer and risk dying inside the wreckage. Or leave now and let the machine finish falling without you. The pilot chose to wait, just a little longer. At a certain point, survival stops being about control. It becomes about timing. By the time only one man remained at the front of the aircraft, the bomber had already crossed an invisible threshold. It was no longer stable in the way aircraft are meant to be stable. It was stable only because nothing had yet disturbed the fragile balance holding it together. This distinction mattered. The engines were still running, 3 of them, producing a steady, even roar. As long as they ran, the bomber continued forward. As long as it moved forward, the wings continued to produce lift. As long as lift existed, the aircraft did not fall straight down. But none of this meant the aircraft was controllable. Without hands on the control cables, the pilot had no direct authority over the rudder, elevators, or ailerons. Any correction now came indirectly through engine power, through changes in airflow, through the inherent tendencies of a design no longer operating within its intended limits. The aircraft was not flying because it was being flown. It was flying because it had not yet failed. This is the moment where instinct urges immediate escape. Every signal said it was time to leave. Structural integrity was compromised. Control was minimal. Fuel status was unknown. Altitude was dropping. The odds were no longer improving. And yet, the pilot stayed. Not out of denial, not out of stubbornness, and not because he believed the aircraft could be saved. He stayed because time still had value. Each second, the bomber remained airborne, increased the distance between the men already descending under parachutes and the wreckage that would soon mark the crash site. Search patterns on the ground relied on correlation. Parachutes near debris meant quick capture. Separation complicated everything. This was not speculation. Bomber crews knew this. Evasion manuals emphasized dispersion. Distance created uncertainty. Uncertainty bought time. So the pilot stayed, not to save the aircraft, but to weaponize it, using its remaining momentum to protect people no longer aboard. This was a role no aircraft commander was trained for. There were no procedures for intentionally delaying escape to improve the survival odds of others. Doctrine assumed evacuation would be coordinated and rapid. This situation inverted that logic. The longer he stayed, the more dangerous it became. Without anyone holding the cables, the bomber began to respond sluggishly to even small disturbances. The nose dipped, then corrected itself. The wings rocked gently, then more noticeably. Each oscillation placed additional stress on a structure already near failure. The pilot could feel this through the airframe. Aircraft communicate with their pilots in subtle ways. Vibrations change. The sound of airflow shifts. Forces that were once smooth become irregular. These cues do not appear in manuals, but pilots learn them. He understood that the tail was close to its limit. He also understood that once he left his seat, the aircraft would lose what little balance remained. The act of standing, of moving toward an exit, would be enough to tip the bomber into a steeper descent. This meant the final escape would not be orderly. It would be rushed. He watched the horizon, counting seconds without instruments, without reference, measuring time by engine noise, and descent rate felt through his body. At a certain point, staying longer no longer added meaningful separation. The distance gained per minute diminished as altitude dropped and speed increased. The benefit curve flattened. That was the moment. He released the throttles. Immediately, the aircraft responded. Power changes had been acting as a stabilizing force. Without them, the bomber began a gentle roll, then a steeper one. The nose dipped more aggressively. The countdown had begun. Moving through the aircraft was now a race against physics. The wind pressure at the front was immense. The open cavity where the nose had been pulled forward like a vacuum. If he lost balance there, he would be dragged out uncontrollably. He moved carefully, deliberately, knowing that haste could be fatal. Behind him, the bomber accelerated. Without corrections, the aircraft transitioned from a controlled descent into a developing dive. Airspeed increased. Control forces intensified. The structure protested. This was the final paradox. Craft was most dangerous at the moment it was about to be abandoned. He reached the exit point with seconds to spare. There was no time to prepare, no time to check surroundings. The ground below was a blur of terrain and distance. Altitude was sufficient, but closing fast. When he jumped, the slipstream struck like a physical barrier. For an instant, the aircraft was still beside him, engines roaring, wings flexing, tail vibrating violently. Then it was gone. The bomber continued downward, now free of human influence. What followed would be inevitable. Structural failure was no longer a question of if, but when, and the answer would come soon. The pilot left the aircraft. The outcome was no longer uncertain. It was only delayed. A bomber without active control does not immediately disintegrate. For a short period, it continues on momentum and residual stability, coasting on aerodynamic habits built into its design. Wings keep lifting, engines keep pulling. The aircraft appears, briefly, almost normal. This illusion is dangerous. Without human correction, small instabilities compound rapidly. A slight roll increases drag on one wing. Drag pulls the nose further off axis. Airspeed increases unevenly. Control surfaces deflect without intention. Structural loads rise beyond what the airframe was designed to endure. The bomber entered a shallow dive. Not vertical, not dramatic, just steep enough to accelerate. As speed increased, forces multiplied. Vibrations that had once been manageable became violent. The fuselage flexed along stress lines created by the initial blast. Rivets loosened, structural members bent under asymmetric loads. At altitude, air is thin. Structural failure often waits. As the bomber descended, air density increased, and with it, stress. This is where the aircraft crossed its final threshold. The tail section, already weakened by oscillation and blast damage, absorbed the brunt of the forces. The horizontal stabilizers fought turbulent airflow. The vertical fin twisted under yaw, forces no one was correcting anymore. Then the tails separated. This was not gradual. It was instantaneous. The moment the tail detached, the aircraft lost longitudinal stability. Without stabilizing surfaces, the fuselage pitched violently, nose down. What remained of the bomber transitioned from an aircraft into a falling object. The engines were still running when this happened. They continued to produce thrust for seconds, even as the aircraft rotated beyond recoverable angles. Propellers spun uselessly against the air. Fuel continued to flow until impact interrupted everything at once. The bomber struck the ground at high speed. There was no survivable space left inside it. Fuel ignited on impact. The structure fragmented. Fire consumed what remained. Whatever had not already broken apart did so on the ground. The machine that had stayed airborne against logic and design was finally finished. Above the wreckage, parachutes drifted. The men who had left earlier descended into a world that was suddenly quiet. The roar of engines faded. The violence of the air gave way to wind, gravity, and time. For them, survival was not yet complete. Landing injured crews in enemy territory introduced a new set of dangers. Broken bones, trees, rivers, armed patrols. Each descent ended with uncertainty. Some landed hard, others became entangled in branches. Injuries were common. Capture was inevitable. The region below was heavily controlled. Search parties responded quickly to downed aircraft. Parachutes were visible from miles away. Smoke from the crash marked the site. Within hours, the survivors were found. They were wounded, exhausted, and no longer part of a bomber crew. They were prisoners. From a military perspective, the incident ended there. No targets destroyed beyond those already hit. No aircraft recovered. No strategic victory recorded. But the significance of what happened did not lie in its immediate outcome. It lay in what it exposed. This aircraft did not survive because it was well designed. It did not stay airborne because Doctrine accounted for it. It did not endure because commanders planned for this scenario. It survived because human beings found a way to operate in a space where Doctrine stopped applying. What happened over Budapest contradicted core assumptions of the bomber war. It showed that survivability did not end when control systems failed. It showed that adaptability could temporarily replace engineering. It showed that control was not always located where planners believed it was. These lessons were not written into manuals. They surfaced quietly in after-action reports, in debriefings, in stories crews told each other. They influenced how people thought about redundancy, crew coordination, and the limits of machines under stress. The bomber fell, but the idea that machines alone decided outcomes fell with it. Remained was a deeper understanding of air warfare, one shaped not by theory, but by moments where theory collapsed and human judgment took over. And that understanding would echo beyond a single aircraft, beyond a single crew, into how wars in the air would be fought from that point forward. Did not pause to acknowledge what happened in the sky that day. No medals were awarded for 10 minutes without a cockpit. No doctrine was rewritten overnight. No official lesson plan was circulated across air commands. From the outside, it looked like just another bomber lost over Europe. But wars are not shaped only by what is announced. They are shaped by what is noticed. The men who survived that flight did not return to combat. They entered captivity. Their war ended not with a landing, but behind wire and watchtowers. For months, their story existed only among themselves, retold quietly, stripped of drama, reduced to facts and decisions and timing. Yet those facts traveled. Pilots talk. Engineers listen. Commanders absorb patterns even when they don't publicize them. Incidents like this one did not become doctrine, but they altered assumptions. The bomber war had been built on the belief that control was centralized, that when the cockpit was lost, the aircraft was lost. That survival ended when design limits were exceeded. What happened over Budapest suggested something different. It showed that control could fragment and still function, that humans could temporarily replace systems, that survivability extended beyond what machines were built to guarantee. This realization mattered more than it seemed. As the war continued, air forces quietly adjusted how they thought about redundancy, crew training, and failure tolerance. They invested more in damage control knowledge. They emphasized crew coordination under extreme stress. They accepted that aircraft did not fail in clean, predictable ways. The lesson was not that improvisation should be relied upon. It was that reality would always outrun design. The aircraft that flew without a cockpit did not win a battle, but it exposed a weakness in certainty, and that weakness forced a change in thinking. After the war, aviation moved rapidly toward systems that reduced reliance on human strength alone. Hydraulic redundancy, power-assisted controls, layered backups, all aimed at preventing a situation where survival depended on raw force and timing. In that sense, the bomber's failure pointed forward. For the men involved, the meaning was simpler. They survived something that should not have been survivable, not because they were exceptional in a cinematic sense, but because they adapted faster than the situation collapsed. They did not follow doctrine. They did not wait for permission. They responded to reality as it presented itself. That distinction matters. History often frames war as a contest between machines and strategies, but moments like this reveal a quieter truth. Wars are also decided in the gaps between plans, where individuals confront problems no one prepared them for. The 10 minutes without a cockpit were not heroic because they were dramatic. They were heroic because they were rational, because faced with an impossible situation, the crew did not panic, did not surrender control to fear, and did not cling to procedures that no longer applied. They redefined what control meant long enough to change outcomes for real people. The aircraft fell. But the idea that survival ended where design limits ended did not survive with it. That idea fractured in midair, carried downward not by wreckage, but by memory. And in wars defined by machines, memory is often what quietly shapes the next generation of decisions.